think laws, policies, or protests bring about change, and they do. But beneath them lies something far more intimate, something deeply human: the telling of personal stories. Think of the Me Too movement. It began with survivors of sexual harassment and assault sharing their stories, sometimes in just two words: Me Too. And yet, these two words carried generations of silenced pain, unspoken experiences, and the courage to break through shame. Or think of George Floyd. His name became a rallying cry, not just because he tragically lost his life, but because the story of his final words, "I can't breathe," resonated with a history of racial injustice in America and beyond. Hello and welcome back to the Personal Lens, the space where we explore the political through the personal. This is Jayanti, and today we are diving into something that sits at the very heart of why social change happens: stories. Stories make statistics human. They transform abstract injustice into something people can feel, see, and relate to. And once you feel a story, it's very hard to unfeel it. So today we are asking, what is the power of personal stories in social movements? How do they transform silence into speech and speech into action? Why stories move us? Humans are storytelling beings. Before laws, before written language, we had oral traditions, stories passed down by elders, myths that explain the universe, folk songs that carried memory. But why do stories matter so much for movements? First, stories humanize abstract issues. You might hear that one in three women face gender based violence. That's horrifying. But numbers can feel distant. Now compare that to listening to a survivor telling her lived experience, the trembling in her voice, the detail of everyday fear and horror. And suddenly, that statistic has a face. Second, stories build empathy. We may not share the same identity, class, race, or gender, but when someone opens up about their struggle, listeners can recognize echoes of their own humanity. And third, stories break the silence. Silence often protects systems of oppression. Patriarchy, racism, casteism, ableism all thrive in environments where people's experiences are dismissed or unseen. When a story is spoken out loud, it punctures that silence. Let's look at Me Too. Tarana Burke, an activist, first used the phrase Me Too in 2006 as a way to help young black women and girls connect through shared experiences of sexual violence. But in 2017, when the phrase went viral on social media, millions of women across the globe began sharing their stories. What happened? Visibility. People suddenly realized that this wasn't an isolated problem. Collective voice. Stories once whispered in private became a chorus too loud to ignore. Accountability. Public figures, corporations, and institutions had to respond. This wasn't just catharsis, it was activism. It changed workplace policies, it shifted cultural conversations, it made governments sit up and take notice. But it also revealed complexities. Some voices, particularly women of color, trans women, and working class survivors, were not amplified as much as others. This teaches us whose stories gets heard matters as much as the story itself. Now let's turn to Black Lives Matter. The movement gained momentum in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin. What gave it strength? Stories. Trayvon wasn't just a statistic. He was a 17-year-old boy in a hoodie walking home with Skittles and iced tea. When his mother, Sabrina Fulton, spoke about her son, she gave the world not just a headline, but a narrative of injustice. Fast forward to George Floyd in 2020, his death was filmed and his story spread across the globe. That act of bearing witness, of recording and sharing, transformed an individual tragedy into a collective demand for justice. Black Lives Matter is proof that stories, when shared widely, can become evidence. They document systemic violence and force societies to reckon with what's happening in plain sight. Climate activism and future generations. Climate change is often described in parts per million rising sea levels degrees Celsius. But here's the challenge: numbers don't always inspire action. That's where stories step in. Greta Thunberg didn't just present facts, she told her story. She spoke about her fear for the future, her frustration with political inaction, her refusal to go to school because why study for a future that is being destroyed? In India, movements like those against the Huonkhiri Dam in Assam or the Chipko movement in Uttarakhand gained strength because villagers, often women, shared how the environment was tied to their daily survival. Their stories weren't about abstract climate science, they were about food, water, and life itself. When women hear these lived experiences, climate change stops being a distant issue and becomes a moral urgency. We've spent the episode celebrating the power of personal stories, but here's the truth: storytelling isn't always easy. And it isn't always safe. For many, telling their story is a radical act that comes with real risks. First, the risk of reliving the trauma. When survivors of violence or discrimination speak out, they are often forced to reopen wounds. Imagine a survivor of sexual assault recounting her experience on a public platform. Not only does she revisit the pain, but she may also have to deal with judgment, disbelief, and even blame. This emotional toll is enormous. Healing doesn't always align with activism, and we must recognize that. Second, the risk of backlash. Not every society rewards truth telling. In fact, many punish it. Whistleblowers often face job loss, harassment, or worse. Think of climate activists in India who speak against large projects. They may be branded as anti development or troublemakers. Or women in small towns who share their Me Too experiences online. They risk being shamed by family, losing marriage prospects, or being isolated in their communities. The cost of speaking can be crushing. Third, the problem of selective amplification. Not every story is giving the same platform. Media tends to spotlight certain narratives while sidelining others. In Me Too stories of Hollywood, actresses reached millions. But what about the domestic workers, factory workers, or women in rural India who face harassment daily? Their voices are often muted. This reveals a harsh truth. Even within social movements, power decides whose story matters most. Fourth, the burden of representation. Sometimes, when someone from a marginalized group shares their story, society treats them as if they represent all people like them. For example, a single queer person speaking about discrimination may suddenly be seen as the spokesperson for the entire LGBTQ plus community. That's heavy and unfair burden to carry. And finally, the risk of co option. Stories can be powerful, but they can also be commodified. We've seen corporations jump on the bandwagon using feminist slogans or Black Lives Matter imagery in ads, not because they care, but because it sells. When this happens, stories lose their edge, becoming marketing tools instead of catalysts for real change. But here's the key insight: none of these risks mean storytelling should stop. Rather, they remind us that sharing stories is not a neutral act. It's deeply political choice, and it demands courage, community support, and responsible listening. So the next time you hear a personal story in a movement, pause. Think about the cost of telling it and ask yourself, how can I make sure this person's truth is honored, protected, and not exploited? Because storytelling is not just about speaking, it's also about how we listen. So, we've explored the power and risks of storytelling, but the big question is, how do stories actually create change? How does one person's lived experience ripple out into something much larger, sometimes even reshaping society? Firstly, stories mobilize people. When someone shares their truth, it can light a fire under others. Think of Nirbhaya's case in India in 2012. Her story wasn't just reported, it was told again and again with the details of her suffering piercing through the numbness of a nation. That personal tragedy mobilized thousands of young people onto the streets demanding justice and legal reform. It wasn't just a crime statistic anymore, it was a story that made people say, that could have been me, my sister, my friend. Second, stories shift culture long before they change laws. Laws are slow, culture moves faster. For example, when Ellen came out on American television in the late 1990s, it didn't instantly change laws, but her story made millions of viewers rethink what it meant to know someone who was gay. That cultural shift laid the groundwork for later political victories. In India, films like Thappar or Lapata Ladies don't just entertain, they tell stories that nudge audiences into questioning patriarchy and everyday sexism. Before policy can change, people must first be able to imagine change. Third, stories connect struggles across borders. A farmer in Assam speaking about the impact of floods, a young climate activist in Sweden striking outside her parliament, and an islander in the Pacific talking about losing their home to rising seas. These are different stories, but when told on global platforms, they weave a tapestry of shared struggle. Movements gain strength when people realize we are not alone. Our fight is connected to yours. Fourth, stories create accountability. Governments and corporations can ignore numbers, but it's harder to ignore a name, a face, a voice that refuses to disappear. When Dalit activists in India share their stories of caste based discrimination, it forces institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. When survivors of workplace harassment tell their stories, organizations scramble to change policies, not because they want to, but because public accountability leaves them no choice. And finally, stories create legacy. Think of Anne Frank's diary. It wasn't a political treatise, it was a story of one teenage girl. Yet, decades later, it still teaches us about the horrors of fascism and the resilience of the human spirit. Stories outlive policies, they carry memory, they make sure injustice is never forgotten and resistance is never erased. But here's something crucial. Stories alone don't change the world. What changes the world is when stories are heard, believed, and acted upon. That's where we come in as listeners, as allies, as amplifiers. So when you encounter a story, whether it's a survivor's testimony, a protester's cry, or even your grandmother's memory of surviving hardship, don't just consume it as content. Ask, how does this change me? What can I do differently because of this? Because the real power of stories isn't just in the telling, it's in what happens after you hear them. So, as we come to the end of this conversation, I want you to pause and think. What is one personal story that has shaped your worldview? Maybe it's a story of resilience, someone in your family who faced adversity and refused to give up. Maybe it's a story of injustice you once witnessed that still makes your blood boil. Or maybe it's a quiet, tender story, an act of kindness that taught you something about humanity. Whatever it is, that story matters because stories are not just memories, they are seeds. Seeds that can grow into empathy, into action, into movements that ripple far beyond the movement they were first told. And here's the thing, stories don't belong only to the famous or the powerful. They belong to you, to me, to every voice that dares to speak, and every ear that dares to listen with an open heart. When Tarana Burke first said Me Too, she had no idea it would ignite a global movement. When Greta Thunberg sat alone outside her parliament with a sign, she didn't know it would inspire millions. Change begins with a single story told bravely, received deeply, carried forward collectively. So, as you step away from this episode, I leave you with an invitation. Don't just listen to stories, become a storyteller, become a witness, become an amplifier. Because the personal is political, and the political only becomes possible when the personal is heard. Thank you for listening to The Personal Lens. Until next time, keep telling your stories and keep listening for the ones that just might change the world. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share. And share your stories to thepersonallens@gmail.com and keep looking through the personal lens.